For millennia, indigenous peoples thrived across the vast landscapes of what is now the United States. Their rich cultures, traditions, and societies were deeply connected to the land. However, the arrival of European settlers marked the beginning of profound challenges and transformations. Christopher Columbus's arrival in 1492 marked the beginning of centuries of colonization. Indigenous populations faced catastrophic consequences as European diseases spread rapidly, killing millions who had no immunity. Economically, native trade systems were undermined as Europeans introduced their own systems and claimed lands. Socially, entire cultures were disrupted or destroyed. Health-wise, disease, violence, and displacement caused massive declines in life expectancy. The Indian Removal Act, signed by President Andrew Jackson, forced the relocation of over 60,000 indigenous people from their ancestral lands to areas west of the Mississippi River. The Trail of Tears resulted in thousands of deaths due to exposure, disease, and starvation. Economically, tribes lost fertile lands. Socially, communities were torn apart. Health-wise, the trauma of removal and poor living conditions had long-term consequences. Also known as Custer's Last Stand, this battle was a rare moment of indigenous resistance success, where Lakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne warriors defeated U.S. forces. However, it led to harsher military retaliation. Economically and socially, it brought more restrictions and eventual confinement to reservations. Health impacts included increased malnutrition and trauma due to isolation and military violence. The Dawes Act divided communal tribal lands into individual plots, forcing indigenous peoples to adopt Euro-American farming lifestyles. Unused land was sold to white settlers, causing tribes to lose 90 million acres. Economically, it led to poverty. Socially, it disrupted traditional communal life. Health-wise, poverty and poor housing contributed to illness and despair. U.S. troops killed over 250 Lakota people, including women and children, at Wounded Knee. The massacre marked the end of armed indigenous resistance. Economically and socially, it signified total dominance by U.S. authorities. Health impacts were immediate: loss of life, generational trauma. The IRA reversed the Dawes Act, allowing tribes to form self-governments and regain communal land ownership. Economically, it helped rebuild some communities. Socially, it supported cultural revitalization. However, implementation was inconsistent and not all tribes benefited equally. This act aimed to assimilate indigenous peoples into urban society by encouraging them to move to cities. Economic opportunities were often promised, but rarely delivered. Socially, relocation caused the loss of cultural ties. Health issues included poverty, racism, and inadequate access to health care. A group of indigenous activists occupied Alcatraz Island for 19 months to protest broken treaties and advocate for indigenous rights. This event inspired the Red Power movement. Socially and politically, it re-energized indigenous activism. Economically, it drew attention to systemic inequality. Health-wise, it promoted community pride and mental wellness. This act aimed to protect indigenous peoples' rights to practice traditional religions, including access to sacred sites. Socially, it was a step toward cultural healing. Health-wise, spiritual practices supported mental and emotional wellness. In 2009, the U.S. issued a formal apology to Indigenous people for historical wrongs, though it was not widely publicized.
I believe Washington can't and shouldn't dictate a policy agenda for Indian country. Tribal nations do better when they make their own decisions. That's why we're here today. Now, I want to be clear about this. Today's summit is not lip service. We're not going to go through the motions and pay tribute to one another and then furl up the flags and go our separate ways.
Socially and politically, it acknowledged past injustices but lacked practical support. Its impact on economic and health outcomes was minimal, but it symbolized progress. The Standing Rock Sioux and allies protested the Dakota Access Pipeline's route through sacred lands. The protests drew global attention.
Right now, how do you feel with them coming on treaty land? How do you feel in your own land of your ancestors? How do you feel?
I feel disrespected. I feel hurt. You know, I feel just hurt that these guys won't never understand. You know, I try to tell them, but you know, the only reason why we're moving back is because they're armed, batons, tear gas, riot gear, weapons, rubber bullets. That's what it takes for them to push us back. They carry weapons because they're scared.
What does this land mean to you, this traditional land?
This land means everything. Look at over there, all the buffalo. Look at all those buffalo. Look at all those buffalo there. I'm coming for you guys. Be careful.
Economically, it highlighted Indigenous land rights. Socially, it united tribes and supporters. Health-wise, police violence and harsh conditions at protest sites caused injuries, but the movement fostered resilience and solidarity. As we reflect on the long arc of Indigenous history in the United States, from first contact in 1492 to the resistance at Standing Rock, one truth becomes clear. Indigenous peoples have endured centuries of loss, trauma, and displacement. Yet through every chapter of violence, assimilation, and injustice, they have also demonstrated extraordinary strength, resilience, and cultural survival. Each event in this timeline tells a story not only of hardship, but of resistance and revival. The impacts of colonization, economic marginalization, broken treaties, systemic poverty, and health inequities still shape Indigenous lives today. But so does resistance. The fight to protect land, language, ceremony, and identity continues.